Hello, I'm with Marshall Brennan of ChemRxiv, but I want to first stop right there. Did I pronounce that right? It's ChemRxiv. So I just want to make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. So Marshall, give us a tutorial on the website.
Right. Well, thanks for having me. And so, yes, so it's ChemRxiv. And so the story of this is archived.org, the original, so the OG preprint server. They originally had it in their logo as an actual Greek chi instead of an X. So that was the joke, it's archive, right? But putting that to a URL, you turn it to an X and things get translated enough. And so when BioArchive started their service, they found that essentially market tested better if they capitalize the R, because then otherwise they were BioArchive, right? And so, then when we went to do it, we also capitalized the R. And what we've realized is that, for the people who get the in joke, it's really a great name. And, once people know ChemRxiv, like, it markets really well, I guess. But I've heard everything from, ChemRxiv, is how they would say it to me, to I've also got ChemRivix. I've had someone tell me ChemRivix, and then I'll say ChemRxiv to them, and they'll continue saying ChemRivix anyway. So anyway,
that's how I was. Somebody corrected me, and I kept saying the wrong thing, and then I realized, oh, I had the name wrong. So the website is a preprint service, and it's ChemRxiv.org, correct?
Right. Yep, absolutely. And it's at the end of the day, as long as you can spell it, that's all that really matters. And so we had some imposters early on, but we had bought out every domain except for the one with an A right in front of the R, and now luckily that person just stopped paying their domain fee, and so now we have that one as well. But it's one of these things where it's a cool name, but it is a confusing name for the non-expert. We recognize that.
Okay, so now we know how to spell it, we know how to find it. So I'm going to just ask, what is it, and how did it come to be? Because I actually had no idea that this website existed until I went to a chemistry professor's party last September, and the conversation. I think we had probably 45 minutes of a conversation about ChemRxiv or ChemRxiv. So I want to hear from you, what is it and how did it come to be?
Yeah, so ChemRxiv is a preprint server. Now, that is a fancy way of saying is it's a place where you can put your papers prior to peer review. We give them a DOI. You can put, depending on the journal, you can put on during peer review. But the idea is that this is the sort of nascent phase of a paper. So it's more farther along than what you would give as a talk or a seminar, but it is not quite a journal article yet. So it's in that magical time where it's mostly a complete story, but it's still malleable because you can still get feedback on it. And so that is the crux of it. And really, if you take nothing else away, our major goal with a preprint server is we're just decoupling dissemination from validation. So that's something that journals have historically done both of those tasks, but with a preprint server, you can now leave the dissemination up to the journal, or you can sort of take it into your own hands. So take the freedom of movement back to yourself and say, okay, I think this is at least safe enough for people to read before it goes to peer review, so you can get feedback. You can put something a little bit more solid on your CV or whatever it is, or a grant application, and have it out there, but then still go through a rigorous peer review without having the cloud of when will people be able to read this hanging over your head. And so that's what ChemRxiv is a place for you to put your papers when you decide they're ready. Whether that's before, before peer review usually is when people do that.
Yeah, and so that's actually, I heard about it last September and then was talking to a faculty member on an Alchemie demo last February, or this February, and was just putting finishing touches on ACS book chapter. And this faculty member reminded me of ChemRxiv, and I said, oh, I need this because I was in the process of writing a grant proposal, and I also have investors that are very interested in our content. They're not in the academic world. They would have no idea how to find some of the information. So I I think at your urging, you asked me, you said contact the editors first to make sure it's okay, and which I did, and they said yes. And so I put it on ChemRxiv, and then I submitted probably within a week to the editor.
Right.
So is there a specific process that goes on? Do you have to do that, or how does that work?
So yeah, so things have changed a lot since, last September for sure. So when we started this, it was less than half of all chemistry journals, industry wide, took preprints. So most notably, the Journal of the American Chemical Society was a long time holdout on whether or not they would take submissions that were preprints. And so early on, it was definitely one of those things where you wanted to check with the journal because, if you made a mistake, you then could submit there. Nowadays, we're at a point where I say greater than 99% of chemistry journals take preprints, and certainly anywhere a person would by default think of going to takes preprints. And the only reason I couch it at 99% is because I'm sure there's some journal out there that doesn't take preprints hiding in the woodwork, and I just haven't heard of them yet. But I'm pretty confident in saying that most of the places where the great majority of people are going to want to publish, they take chemistry preprints. So that's exciting. So nowadays, the preprint policies on the websites tend to be a bit more up to date. It's definitely much more an exception that a journal doesn't take preprints rather than the rule. So that makes your life a little easier. And so these days, there's a little bit less risk in just preprinting and going. It's always good to make sure you know the journal's policy ahead of time. But generally speaking, you don't necessarily need to ask permission anymore. Although again, it depends on your position on asking forgiveness versus or permission. So,
Exactly.
that's always up to you. But the fears a lot of people had early on, which they weren't unjustified. Like early in the early days of ChemRxiv, it was kind of a wild west of who took which preprints. But now all ACS journals take preprints, all RSC journals take preprints, all GDCH owned journals take preprints. Everything at Wiley, Elsevier, Springer Nature, PNAS, AAAS, all of those publishing houses have either blanket policies or have policies for all of their journals that allow preprints, either without any caveats, or usually, the only restriction I've heard of at an ACS journal is the inorganic and organic portfolios ask that you not revise your preprint while they're in the process of reviewing things. So they just don't want the reviewers to have been sent a version of a paper and then go online and see a different version of the paper. So they ask you to sync your revisions with their decisions, I guess.
Oh,
And so it's again a very different world from when you and I first talked about this, which is again better to seek permission than forgiveness.
I think one of my favorite parts about going to ChemRxiv is actually seeing the breadth of research in chemistry all in one place, all changing daily. I think it's just inspiring for me. I just want to ask, is there like a specific area that are the high users, and maybe is there one that's coming up behind, like growing in I just wonder, is there sort of trends to who is using ChemRxiv right now and
Ab-
maybe in the past?
Absolutely. So the first, I will say that the makeup of who submits to ChemRxiv, has been changing as a function of time for sure. So historically, computational chemistry has been our biggest subject for a while. Biological chemistry, so ChemBio and whatnot, was up there as well with materials. And that all makes sense because those are the folks that were using archive and bioarchive up to this point, and so they had some amount of familiarity with what preprints were. The first real sign that I knew that this was going to make it was actually when organic chemistry appeared in our top 5 subjects, and it's currently our number 3 subject. So we've got 25% of our submissions right now are computational, followed by 13% or are materials, followed by 10% that are organic. And I don't have the numbers offhand for like what the makeup of the past month was, but I would expect it to be even less dominated by computational chemistry, not because we're getting less of it, but because we're getting more from these other areas. And so when I started this, a lot of folks told me not to even bother talking to organic chemists. They're saying, especially the methodology folks, they're never going to want to, submit to something like this. It just doesn't jive with what they do. And so early on, we got, some total synthesis, and they're like, yeah. Well, no one's going to, what do you want to call it? Scoop a total synthesis, in the course of a couple of months, but you'll never get methodology. Now, organic methodology is, like I said, one of our top 3 subjects that we get. And this is not me saying that we need more organic chemistry, but as we start seeing these percentages shift, it starts looking much more what we see as the field at large. And that is encouraging in the sense that this is starting to look more like the distribution of, everybody sort of using it, as opposed to it just being another tool for computational chemists. And in fact, long term, we expect that computational chemists and biological chemistry will probably be in our smaller subjects because they have other places that they can take their work. And so they're trying to decide which audience wants to read it more. But right now, you're going to see a lot of computational and theory on the server. You're going to see a lot of material, and you're going to see a lot of organic. And the areas that are really growing that I'm keeping an eye on, I'm really excited about, are analytical chemistry. That has more than doubled in content in the past, 6 to 8 months. In inorganic chemistry, very similar to that. And then another area, which is, whether you consider it an offshoot of computational or not, that I'm really excited about, is looking at how artificial intelligence is growing. And so that's an area where that is the papers that fall into that bucket are about half as much as organic chemistry. So again, that's growing a whole lot as well. And for your information, I'll just go ahead and say that chemical education is right there in that area too, where it's not necessarily our biggest subject yet, but it's definitely growing, and I'm really excited to see where else we go with that. We actually had a paper just go up today on chemical education. So
good.
still,
that leads
still
to
alive and well.
Oh, great. That leads to my next question, because, most of our users at Alchemie are at primarily undergraduate institutions, and many are involved in undergraduate research. And one of our users said, how this would be a great resource for undergraduates to, put together their papers with their advisors and submit it, and then send it out to their peers and others in that area to get feedback. How many do if you have any feeling on undergraduate focused papers coming through ChemRxiv or not?
Yeah, so that's a bit harder to track down because, we, at least in automated fashion, we haven't gone and figured out, how many things come from POI specifically or whatnot. We definitely, see a fair amount of stuff coming from chemical education that sort of tends to come out of, primarily undergraduate institutions. But we've had a couple cases that I've been really excited about. So there's one paper, it's probably about a year old now, that was a real success, from Alex McCoyne's lab at UCLA. And so what he had started doing is he was teaching a chemistry lab course for advanced undergraduates. And as part of this course, they all worked together to put together a paper on palladium catalysis. And the paper went up on ChemRxiv, and that was what happened at the end of the semester when everybody was done. And the students apparently loved it because they could send it to their families. The family can read it for free. They get to put it on their CV, and they get that sort of tangible external result immediately. And that's a huge confidence booster, especially for these folks that are juniors, getting ready to think about whether they're going to apply to graduate school. Starting to be able to point and be like, that's my paper. Even if it's not peer reviewed, it's still out there. And then that paper ended up getting into Dalton transactions, and it was, some months after the class had ended. But the whole idea is that using ChemRxiv as the endpoint for that undergraduate research, in that case tied to a class, I thought that was a really clever use of the service, and it was a way to really give, his undergraduates a lot of personal investment in the process. And so I'll send you a link to that one after we're done here.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. And we are writing a paper right now on the back-end data of our mechanism system. And we are not experienced chem ed producers of research. So, my background is totally a practitioner level, and my content specialist, Sarah, is a PhD in synthesis. So we are going to actually use it, produce the paper and get it out there, and then use that link to get feedback from the top ChemEd groups before we actually submit it to either JChemEd or CERP. And I think that's a great use of ChemRxiv, and also for students to use that in their CVs and moving forward in different ways. Are there, other than that UCLA study, are there any really unique ways that you've seen ChemRxiv being used?
Oh, so that's probably the most interesting case for chemical education for sure. Where I'm really excited about this for other areas, we've had people talk about submitting negative results, which I think is something that has the potential to be really cool. For our purposes, we like things that go on to be published in journals because it sort of validates what we're doing. But for all intents and purposes, things don't necessarily need to go on to a journal. And so if it's a valuable piece of work that just it's a failed result for you, but maybe it's worth having on the literature, this is a great place to put that. So when we start thinking about how we can deal with things that maybe don't need to be published, so we've got folks putting out strong methodology work that maybe it's not clear where this particular starting material synthesis is going to go, but maybe it ends up attached to a different paper later. That's pretty interesting. Now, one area that is really, I think it kind of takes advantage of the technology and makes us rethink, what the publication process is from a sort of cultural perspective, is what's happening in organic chemistry a lot. What I've seen is people will submit a paper that is ostensibly, it's an internally complete story, but you can kind of tell that there's probably a juicier prize. And by that I mean, like, imagine that you've got a really great new transformation, and you want to and it's a really useful one, but it's the EEs are just terrible, right? In the past, you've sort of got to pick and choose whether or not you're going to just sort of throw that off to a specialist journal and just call it done and hope that the next paper is gets into as good of a journal, or you just cross your fingers and hope nobody scoops you before you solve the EE problem. Well, now at ChemRxiv, what some people are doing is saying, all right, well, I'll go ahead and I'll put up the work on ChemRxiv as I get a DOI. It's not going to protect me from getting scooped necessarily, but it makes sure that I have something out there. And then if my student finishes, fixing the EEs in 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, it doesn't matter. At least it's out there. I'm part of the conversation. I can show the provenance of my work. And if they ever do solve the EE problem, we just revise the preprint, add that information, and then submit it to a journal. So it's a way to sort of have your cake and eat it too, where you don't have to, sort of put out the least publishable unit necessarily, but you can put up your work in, pseudo real time, when you've got, good stopping points where people can make use of it, even if the whole story isn't yet complete. And so I'm really excited to see what people do once they free themselves from, the idea that we don't, put anything out in written form until the entire thing is done and buttoned, but saying like, this is what we have here is useful. We're going to keep working, but let's see what people do with this in the meantime.
That's really interesting. I go back to you and I first met on Twitter, and we actually had a Twitter conversation about ChemRxiv also. And I look at that altmetric score on Twitter, and I had no idea what it was, or on ChemRxiv. Why is that there? Or explain what it is and why it's there, and how does Twitter play into ChemRxiv?
Right. Well, I mean, so Twitter has been a very important part of ChemRxiv's growth, largely because we've had a great following that built up around there. And I'm not sure how much of it is, it was organically there, ready for ChemRxiv, or if it was just that, that's where, I'm really comfortable, obviously. So I am very good at promoting things that came on Twitter. So, one thing led to another. But, early on, we had a huge amount of our content, our usage of our content was coming via Twitter. So that was an indispensable tool for what we were working on. And I like it because as a way to disseminate the work, because people can sort of get things in bits, they can have conversations on the fly. It allows people to highlight their work, and now that it's becoming more, Twitter is becoming more of a accepted tool, for communication amongst scientists. It's a really great way to sort of just blast to a bunch of your colleagues at once. So that's exciting. And the Altmetric widget came up because so Altmetric itself is a tool that is owned by Digital Science that tracks where uh, content is used outside of just the chemical literature. So if you click on that widget, that score represents how many times it's been picked up in news articles and blogs, how many times it's been tweeted and retweeted, and all these different sort of unconventional ways outside of like the strict scientific literature that things have been discussed. And that's actually really important for preprints, because a preprint is in theory not going to be the ultimate version of record, so it's probably not going to be cited forever, if it gets cited at all, because in theory people are going to cite the most recent version, and if that turns out to be a journal article, that's probably where it's going to go. But we still want to make sure that in those earliest stage, that's sort of like the time that is most relevant to a preprint's lifespan, we're tracking how relevant this work is, and allowing people to sort of take advantage of visibility that they've got there, get rewarded for good work, to having those metrics available to them. And so by using Altmetric to track the things that people do on the 1 to 2 day time scale, like post to Twitter or have blog posts written about their work or have journalists pick it up while it's a preprint, that shows up in Altmetric long before it'll show up in the citations. And so both for the validation for our authors to see the response from the community to their work, and also for the community to sort of get a gauge of this hasn't been peer reviewed, so I don't have this Journal X's panel of reviewers to tell me where does this fall in things. But being able to measure with just a sort of qualitative way, this is, a lot of people find this exciting for these various ways, this is something I should probably read. That's a useful tool, especially when the Altmetric then points you to all sorts of things you can read that sort of augment, that conversation.
Yeah,
so that's why that's there. And I'm really excited to see where that takes off in the future too.
It's sort of nice to see the geography too when you click on that widget. So I have to ask you, you were, when we talked earlier, when you actually helped us with our early NSF research with mechanisms, you were at Nature Chemistry. How did you get to this? And then, the follow-up and probably final question is, what do you really like about what this has become? So two-sided questions. How did you get from Nature Chemistry to ChemRxiv? And then what do you like about it? Maybe what do you don't like about it?
So when you say what do I like about it, you're talking about the job?
The job itself. What do you find really interesting in the job? It's a very different kind of publishing job.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take this. I'll start addressing one by way of the other, and sort of as least meandering a way as I can. So I got into Nature Chemistry largely kind of by accident. My original plan was out of my postdoc was I was going to apply for research jobs somewhere, and with my postdoc lab sort of moving very abruptly after I started, it was one of those situations where the job in Nature Chemistry presented itself exactly when I was thinking, okay, maybe it's time to pump the brakes on this postdoc. And so that's how I got into the world of publishing. And I actually loved my editor job, but the thing about the editing job is it's very much after a while like turning the crank. And all jobs kind of become that eventually. If you're doing it right, it's about finding new projects and new ideas to work on to keep it from becoming that. But with a journal, it was very much new work comes in and you're just sort of filtering it out. When I started the position, I definitely viewed it, and for the most part, did view it about like, okay, what things am I elevating? What research do I want to champion? And the longer I was there, the more I realized that these decisions, you get so much excellent research, and you make the decision on the razor's edge that being an editor, it's even if I'm feeling much more passionate about the yeses I give, it's more I end up giving out many more no's, and that kind of didn't jive well with me. So, I mean, of course, I took the hard turn the other way. Now I say yes to most things
Everything.
anyway, but more importantly is that I kind of, I realized that there was this gap for, when things are sitting in peer review, we're tying, what journal they get into with when people read them. And so when people read them, they read them through the lens of this got into X journal, right? And so I had started doing some just, consulting work with ACS on ChemRxiv, just from the perspective of a, professional editor. And so I had gone onto a panel to talk about ChemRxiv at the ACS meeting in Washington, D.C. back in 2017. And I ended up interviewing for the job of running the thing because, it was one of these things where, acceptance rate notwithstanding, I really wanted to build a tool that helped people accelerate their research and elevate it in a way that helped as many people as possible. So when my job at Nature Chemistry, when I hit on something that otherwise wouldn't have been in the limelight and really put it there, that was a huge benefit to that one group, right? But this was a tool where I could say, okay, now we can expand the visibility of a whole lot of different research from a whole lot of different people and give them a new tool that they didn't have before. And I really latched onto that idea, and I've really enjoyed being able to build this this system for people to be able to take some more control over the research. And what kind of is an interesting knock onto that, my measure of success is, obviously we got tons of views and downloads and submissions and whatnot, but what I've really loved watching is that if you track the usage of ChemRxiv articles versus which journal they get into, we're starting to see the journals that are, there seem to be the articles that are more exciting on ChemRxiv are sort of disproportionately going into like specialist journals. And so what we're seeing is that, people are getting both the advantage of going into a specialist journal where it's going to be really, focused in on their subject, but they're getting the wide visibility from being on a generalist server, which just happens to take a lot of really good work. And so, that increased visibility, it's again, it's sort of getting your cake and eating it too, in that, like, you get a lot of eyes on it, and it elevates more research than you had before. And so that's really where I wanted to be, is to continue elevating new research, but also do it in a way that gives us tools we didn't have, as opposed to iterating on the tools we already had.
Well,
And so
that's great. I mean, that's the big mission, and I congratulate you on the growth of ChemRxiv. I hear chemists are late to the party, but here we go. We can take and run with it. I mixed a bunch of metaphors there, but
right. Well, I mean, like, chemists are late to the party, but so the best problem to have is that our submissions are way ahead of where we expected them to be. So by, to give you sort of an idea of this, we had planned for the end of 2020 to be hitting, what's the number? We expected that by the end of 2020, we would have a total of, about 5,600 preprints. And it's now looking like we're going to hit that around Thanksgiving of this year. So in terms of overperforming, so chemists might be late to the party, but they are definitely delivering on enthusiasm for this. And so, I know, the folks at Archive sort of, riff on chemistry for being slow to adopt things, but, at least, chemists seem to be sort of in with both feet so far, which is pretty exciting.